Question number 3, the Honourable Annette King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question's to the Minister of Health. What did he mean by his statement on the 29th of July that core Crown Health expenditure since 2009-10 covers, quote, most but not all inflationary pressures, end quote?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
I've answered this question many times, and I mean exactly that it does cover most but not all inflationary pressures. The balance is found within baselines by redirecting spend from areas where it's not delivering results to areas where it's delivering the results that New Zealanders need and expect.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
Well, if DHBs are meeting cost pressures within their baselines, why have 13 DHBs exceeded their budget by $8.4 million in August alone?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
Well, actually, it's a huge improvement. The collective DHB deficits are about $50 million at the moment, a big improvement from the $150 million we inherited from Labor. So they knew how to run a deficit. They didn't know how to deliver the services.
Supplementary question, the Honourable
If DHBs are managing their cost pressures because there is enough funding, why is the National Health Board meeting with Lakes, Tairāwhiti, Capital and Coast, Hutt Valley and mid-central DHBs to discuss their financial performance?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
Because unlike Labor, we're not going to let the deficits blow out.
Order.
I'm answering the question.
Order. A point of order has been raised. The Honourable.
It's a very straight question. He goes straight to the Labor Party. Why doesn't he answer his own questions?
Order. Well, it's certainly not helpful the way the Minister started, but it would be helpful if the Minister could answer the question, then we'll judge the adequacy of the answer. The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
Because we're not going to let deficits blow out. We can't go back to the situation back in 2008 of a $150 million deficit. And I see Mr Robertson saying today that actually he's prepared to run deficits if he ever becomes Finance Minister, which would be a massive problem for the health system in New Zealand.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
If all DHB's inflationary pressures are basically being covered, as the Minister is telling us, why did the figures provided by his office show a shortfall of $152 million in this financial year?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
As usual, Mrs King's not giving the full picture. That picture that she's painting is an early budget document. The rate of inflation changed considerably from that time, so she's using out-of-date information, but worse, she knows it.
Mr Speaker.
Point of order.
Yes, it is, Annette.
Order.
That's right.
Point of order, the Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, I have a written answer to the Minister, not using ministry figures.
Can I have the point of order?
The point of order is I'd like to table the written answer because the Minister disputes my figures.
Order. The Minister certainly did dispute the figures, but that's a debatable matter. Though, if it's a published written answer, then it's available to all members anyway. Question.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question. The Honourable Annette King.
Were the figures supplied by his office correct when they show that 9 DHBs will need $61.4 million out of their budget this year to manage the government shortfall in funding?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
It's a heck of a lot better than them needing $150 million, and we're determined to make sure the deficits don't blow out. And so if you look at the wider fiscal strategy, we are determined that DHBs live within their means. We're not going to do like Grant Robertson is promising, which is to run deficits to fund health. Very bad idea.
Supplementary question, the Honourable Annette King.
If DHBs are being funded for all their cost pressures, why have 73% of staff recently surveyed at Taranaki DHB reported that in the past 6 months, patient care or treatment has been compromised?
The Honourable Dr. Jonathan Coleman.
Well, I haven't seen that survey, but look, I wouldn't be surprised if it's not exactly saying what Mrs King is saying it does, but what she is saying in her question, she claims...
Point of order, Mr.
Minister
Speaker.
will resume his feet. Point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table the said survey, Care Capacity Demand Management Program, which says exactly what I said.
Order. I will put the leave, but order. I will put the leave, but it is customary, certainly in this House, to do so at the end of an answer. But I will put the leave, certainly in view of the circumstances. Leave is sought to table that particular survey. In order. I might if I have time. Leave is sought to table that particular survey. Is there any objection? There is none. It can. Point of order.
Mr. Speaker, we just had a situation there when I was asked a question. I was halfway through my answer, and you allow Mrs. King to table the document by point of order. I mean, no, I'm happy to answer.
Order. Minister will resume his seat. That's not exactly as it happened at all. A member has a right to raise a point of order at any stage. Order. If the Minister wishes to stay in the House, he will not interrupt when I'm on my feet. The member has a right to raise a point of order at any stage. At the time I accept the point of order, I have no idea what that point of order is. Subsequent to accepting the member having the right to raise a point of order, she then took the opportunity to seek leave to table a document. I did point out to her that it is not the custom of the House to interrupt an answer to do so, but in view of the circumstances, once the interruption had occurred, I allowed the tabling to proceed. Question. Order. You don't need further interjections between the two members. Question number 4, John O'Naylor.
Speaker,